The rope around Anna's wrists burned like nettles, and the spruce wind tasted of iron. She was crying and laughing at once when the villagers pushed her toward the tree line, as if right and mercy were the same thing. Her shoes sank in damp moss. Someone, Marek, the blacksmith, she thought, muttered a prayer she didn't know, and the words bent around her like a net. Her mother's braid had been undone and braided into the offerings at her feet, string of garlic, coins wrapped in yarn, a faded ribbon that smelled like lavender and boiled milk. Anna wanted to scream that she had never agreed to anything, that she did not belong to oaths braided into roots. Her throat held only the stubborn, dry sound of a bird's broken wing. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The villagers, faces furrowed by harvests, winters, and small mercies, formed a half-moon behind her, their eyes not cruel but hollowed by a history they treated like scripture. Anna could see the children of the village pressed against their parents' coats, their mouths making small O's of wonder or fear. Old Dorina, who'd taught Anna to stitch hemstitches and hum the lullabies, had a look like a clenched fist. She had been the one to braid the offerings into Anna's hair. "It's the only way," Dorina said, when Anna finally forced her voice out, a small, betrayed sound. "We keep the root keeps us." Anna wanted to say, "But you kept me." The words throbbed at the edge of her mouth like a taste she couldn't place. 18 winters had passed within the spruce ring. She'd never walked beyond the last bent fence post where the world turned from familiar to rumor. The elders had called her blessing in the same breath as debt. Men had tipped their caps and kissed her hand with reverent pity. Women had shown her how to braid offerings and told her the old lullabies until they became the bones of her nights. She had been taught which mushrooms were safe, how to read the river's impatience, how to bind a sprained ankle with herb and prayer, but never taught how to say no. At the edge of the forest, the air changed. The spruce canopy closed like an unrolling hand. Anna felt the rise of something older than famine and oath and the knotted reasons that made the villagers do what they did. At first, she expected, by everything the stories taught, that the creature approaching would be a shadow of horror, clumsy, monstrous, tooth-bearing. Instead, the silhouette that stepped into the clearing was impossibly tall, the height of trunks, and moved with the hush of falling cones. Moss tangled in the hair on its shoulders. Hands the size of harvest tables spread open, and the eyes, God, were not empty pits, but deep green, lined with the concentric patience of river stones. The creature did not roar. It watched her like a sentry who had been keeping time with a house that belonged to another age. "You are small for the bargain," it said, in a voice that felt like distant thunder and the creak of old porch boards. Anna's mouth went dry. The words were not hers to translate. They arrived in meanings carried by tone and gesture. It tilted its head, and in that space her breath came back to her. She was supposed to fear it, and the villagers' relief at its presence insisted she should. But what rose inside her, against the tight rope, the braided offerings, the weight of a village's survival, was an odd, trembling curiosity. The creature's fingers brushed the braid at her shoulder, gentle enough to be a blessing or a curse. Under its touch, she did not become a thing. She became a person. Someone, something, had noticed. "You speak," she said, because silence felt like being unmoored. The word was small and human, and carried more rebellion than a dozen refusals. The creature's lips, if those folded hairs could be called lips, quivered. It turned its head toward the dark, listening, as if there were other voices threading through the trunks. It was then that Daniel stepped from behind a trunk, hands tucked into a coat that smelled faintly of urban libraries and antiseptic. He had been walking the perimeters for days, his notebook fat with plant names and village lore, eyes that had softened the hard edges of observation into something like tenderness when he looked at Anna. He should not be there. He had been told, politely, to keep to the lane, to respect the old customs. But his shoes were scuffed with the same moss as hers, and his breath came quick with the distance he'd crossed. "Don't touch her," Daniel said, and his voice was a different kind of edge. Not the rasp of fear, but the precise, small anger of someone who believed the world could be better named and therefore changed. The creature did not draw back. It listened. Anna watched him watch her and felt something like rescue loosen inside her. Not a dramatic, cinematic save, but a whisper of possibilities she had only ever folded into her hymn songs. "You are an intruder," Dorina said, voice cracking. "You will upend the pact." "I mean to understand," Daniel said. "I mean to learn why you, call this acceptable." His hand hovered, as if he would reach for Anna and make a new map of the world. She could have put her hand in his and fled right then, run through the pines, past the fence, to trains and city lights and names for herself that didn't end in the hush of a forest. But the rope at her wrists anchored more than her skin. It tied her to generations, to famine stories told with lowered heads. The thing that people whispered, the oldest way about, the creature's bargain, was not only superstition. It was a ledger kept in lives and harvests, in winters that came kinder than elsewhere. "You are patient," Anna said to the creature, because she wanted to speak to somebody who listened without the heavy ledger of legacy. The creature's eyes folded like closed leaves, and it stepped closer until the moss under its feet made an echoing sound, small and grave. It lowered its head, and the air around them grew cool. For a moment she forgot the villagers and the rope and the way her mother's lullaby had set the cadence of her nights. She forgot the idea that she was payment. In the quiet, a different kind of exchange seemed possible. Daniel's notebook lay open where he'd dropped it. A pressed fern trembled inside, an ethnobotanist's attempt to pin down the unpinnable. He had come with cameras and measurements and a belief that there were always words, Latin or otherwise, that could make sense of a place. His mouth, when he spoke next, was gentler. "Anna," he said, and the sound of her name by his lips loosened the old braid of fear. "If you want, you could come with me. We could go to the university. I could help you." "You don't understand," Dorina snapped. Her hands, which had measured the years in stitches sewn by the hearth, trembled now where she had held the offering. "The village is safer if the bargain is kept. The forest gives, but it takes. We know the cost." Anna felt the village press against her like a second skin, warmth, obligation, envy, devotion. She saw the old ledger in their eyes, the famine year when roots were all they had, the spring the river did not rise and the field slept brown. And she understood why the pact had been carved into their days like commandments. But she also saw the way the ledger had been read, as inevitability, not negotiation. And she felt, with a sudden sharpness, how young she was, 19, and locked in an economy of gratitude that amounted to giving her life to keep other lives going. The creature put its hand against her cheek, and the touch was cool, moss and river silt and old rain. It smelled of the inside of trees. "We keep the ring for reasons that were lived and paid for," it said, voice folding into the wind. "The bargain is a rib of the village's survival, but you are not a thing to be cued and given." Daniel stepped forward. The forest seems to hold its breath. Anna's wrists ached. Her chest felt stretched between two promises, one ancient and communal, the other new and intimate. Neither was simple. The creature's eyes shone with an empathy that was not human pity, but a sorrow tempered by weathering. The village watched like a storm waiting to reload. "You came to name us," Dorina accused Daniel, and the word of accusation carried the weight of a woman who had sewn 3 winters' worth of garments with her own hands. "You think words will fix what is older than language." Daniel looked at her, then at Anna. His face was the earnest face of someone who had studied how cultures survived by naming their pain. "I don't know how to fix it," he said, "but Anna doesn't have to be the ledger." The creature made a low sound, not quite a laugh, and not altogether separate from a warning. Anna's heart beat a staccato that felt like the island drum of a promise waking up. The creature's palm hovered, then rested flat against the root-turned earth. It traced a line in the moss, and where it touched, tiny green shoots stirred like thoughts. "You are the first in a long time," it said. "We have kept the ring because the village's debts were once paid surface to surface. But every bargain grows teeth if not tended. You were a child when your mother braided the offering into your hair." Anna's face, in the half-light, was a map of every tenderness and bruise she carried. The lullabies, the teachings, the hunger masked as blessing. "She told me to be brave," Anna whispered, because bravery was the only inheritance she had been taught to value. "She told me the forest listens." "And it does," the creature said. "It listens like a ledger, but letters, names, bindings, they erode if no one reads them differently." This small phrase, "erode if read the same," was not a solution, but it was a fissure. It was the first crack in the hard shell that had kept the village safe and rigid for as long as memories could be remembered. The villagers shifted like a flock uncertain of the wind. Daniel's fingers brushed Anna's rope. It might have been a gesture of comfort or an attempt to cut it. He did not move to free her. The lines between protector and prisoner, between creature and community, had sharpened into a dilemma. Keep the bargain, keep the village, or change the bargain, risk the harvest, and perhaps save a single life from becoming an offering. A child in the crowd began to cry, and the sound made the night keen with urgency. Anna's mother, who had stood near Dorina, had her hands clenched white. There was in her face the kind of sorrow that tasted like ash. She had braided the offerings into her daughter's hair because she had been braided into the offering once, and the memory of that winter, of rumpled blankets and the river's refusal to rise, was a living thing that shaped her hands. "Why must it be like this?" Anna asked, the question less a challenge than a plea. It slid across the clearing, landing in corners. Daniel's notebook, left open on a fallen log, fluttered in the breeze, as if the pages themselves wanted to be read differently. The creature looked at her with an expression that pressed the years into a single, green-eyed compassion. "You ask because you want to unbind," it said quietly. "But unbinding is not only escape. It is also settling the ledger." Settling the ledger. Those words hung between them like a promise or a threat, depending on which side you stood. The villagers looked as if they might sway toward panic or toward prayer. Daniel looked at Anna with something like hope that smelled faintly of recklessness. Anna looked at her own hands, red with rope rawness, and felt the enormous, small, ordinary ache of wanting to choose. As the spruce whispered overhead and the night leaned close, the pact, so long recited as fate, breathed like a living thing. It had kept them fed and housed and surviving. It had also, brutally, folded a person into payment. Anna had been taught to hum a lullaby and to braid offerings into roots. She had not been taught how to refuse. Yet, when a creature with the patient eyes of Riverstone recognized her as more than an offering, and a young man from the city offered the possibility of a different map, the boundaries began to ripple. The first act closed on that ripple. A rope raw on her wrists, a creature's hand like moss, a young man's notebook full of names, and a village watching the moment when a single person might become the axis around which an old bargain either tightened or unraveled. Anna could feel the village breathing as if it were a single weathered lung, in and out, waiting for a verdict it had not yet learned to write. Voices rose and fell like hesitant birds, prayers, threats, bargaining in the old tongues, and younger, sharper words from Daniel that tried to shape the truth into something alterable. She imagined the ledger like a great book hung somewhere between tree and roof, pages yellowed by wind and grief, whose margins were filled with names and winters and the fine pencil strokes of women who kept accounts with lullabies and the steady motion of hands. Tonight, her name, scrawled in a looping, urgent hand, was being read aloud. "You cannot change everything," Dorina said again, and there was blood in the sound of it. "If the ring breaks, we will starve." "Perhaps there are other ways to keep the ring," Daniel said, "ways that do not require this." His voice refused to complete the incarnation of the word. He looked younger here than the university halls ever let him look, too young to shoulder histories he had not lived, and yet old with a compassion that had the danger of belief. The creature listened, and when it shifted, its movement was like a tree rearranging itself. Anna found she wanted to wrap the conversation around definitions. What exactly was being paid? Who decided the rate? Whether rituals could be amended without violence? But the language she had learned was different, full of smell and the tactile memory of braided hair, not syllables for ledger reforms. She had a scholar beside her, and an ancient sentinel in front of her, and a village at her back, and between those three things she felt stretched thin enough to tear. Her mother kept her eyes lowered, and her hands clenched so tight the knuckles shone. In her mouth was a taste of iron and milk, the memory of hunger, and the thought that perhaps the pact had saved them once. He held the winter back," her mother whispered, as if naming the thing aloud could make the past whole. "We were starving before the pact returned the river and the corn." The creature's response was quiet and far-reaching at once. "It is true. I have kept things. I have turned storms and calmed rot at times, but bargains become walls if they are not tended. They are not just one night's price. Bargains are conversation, and conversation requires both ears." Daniel's hand tightened into a fist and opened again, like a man deciding whether his own gestures might be interpreted as threat. "If the pact is a conversation," he said, eyes fixed on the creature's moss-veined face, "then we've been listening to a single line from a long poem. We need to know how it began. We need to know whether the terms were fair." "You do not belong to our conversation," Dorina snapped. Her voice was a blade honed sharp by years of protecting what she believed kept children clothed and warm. "You are an idea from the city. You cannot bear our winters." "I am not here to replace you," Daniel said. His tone softened when he stepped closer to Anna, and she saw the tremor of someone who both feared and admired this stubborn place. "I am here because I study how humans live with plants and spirits. I want to find solutions that do not bleed people." "And what if some solutions require a sacrifice?" Dorina demanded, and the old fear bared like a tooth. "What if the earth will not give without payment?" Anna's mouth felt like dry earth. A different kind of hunger unfurled, one less physical and more a wanting to be named by a future she chose. "Why did mothers braid offerings into daughters' hair?" she asked, turning to the crowd because she needed a witness who understood both the ledger and the person. Her mother's lips pressed together, the line of her face tightening into a map of choices she could not unmake. "Your grandmother said the forest asked," she answered finally. The memory of being 16 and making a bargain with something she did not fully comprehend. She said the fields would prosper if a life was given. We took the bargain to save children. "You were 8, Daniel said suddenly, and his voice snapped like a twig. He'd read it in a record or been told in a tale he had tracked down. Someone from the village had a diary. But the knowledge arrived with a cruelty he did not intend. Your mother was 8 when she bound herself. Did she choose that? The question landed with a thud. The villagers muttered and shifted, the murmurs a rising tide of shame and denial. Anna thought of how her mother had hummed, never a complaint, always a song, and how that song had become the cadence of home. The realization that every kindness might also have been a forfeiture made her want to retch. The creature lowered itself to one knee until its head was nearer to hers. "Choice is a complicated thing," it said. "When your grandmother made that bargain, she did so with the desire to protect. She was taught that protection could require trade. The world we keep is fragile, but I do not want your fear threaded into the roots of my protection." "You say that now," Dorina hissed. "But what of harvests? What of the spring that failed because a young girl refused? Will you let our children starve?" The creature's eyes glinted, reflecting the pinprick light of lanterns. "I do not starve a village for refusal. I keep balance. But balance is not the same as servitude. Long ago, when I first walked in this place, bargains were mutual. There were names and exchanges. Over generations, the shape of the bargain hardened. You all began to offer more than was asked, because you feared the cost if you didn't. Fear makes offerings grow into chains." Anna's throat tightened at the metaphor. She felt the chain in the rope around her wrists, but also in the long habit of bending toward necessity and never questioning its terms. Her childhood had been a long rehearsal in being small for the sake of others. The creature's words unearthed another possibility. Smallness was not evidence of worth. "You could leave," Daniel told her quietly, and for a moment the world narrowed to only the two of them and the open page of his notebook. "I could take you to the city. I could find papers, shelter. You could study. You could learn a language that doesn't begin with obligation." It was the kind of offer that came with 1,000 disclaimers unspoken. The reality of life in a new place, the cost of being an outsider, the weight of guilt. Anna wanted to ask whether Daniel knew how to love someone whose name had been used as a ledger entry. She wanted to know that he would not treat her like another project in the book he carried. Yet his eyes held a raw sincerity that made her want desperately to believe. "What if I stay?" she heard herself say. The words surprised her with their own fearless tremor. They held all the contradictions, her loyalty and her hunger, the tug of home and the possible life beyond. "What if I stay, but I refuse to be a ledger?" The creature's expression folded into something like an old, tired smile. "Then we must rewrite the ledger together. Bargains are not bones, they can be remade. But be warned, words are not enough. The forest answers with gestures. If you ask for a different bargain, you will have to do work with me and with your people. You will have to hold them when they fear, and you will have to hold the forest when it remembers its hunger." Dorina's laugh was brittle. "So the girl who was bound to save us must now teach us to be brave. She is a child still." "You do not get to decide whether I am a child," Anna said, and the anger in her words tasted like something fierce and new. Her mother's face changed. There was pride and sorrow braided together. And even Dorina's posture faltered, as if struck by an unforeseen wind. Daniel's hand brushed against her elbow, not possessively, but as if to ground her in possibility. The first steps of unmaking a thing are never neat. They were messy and small. Daniel promised to question outside powers who might pressure the village into old compromises. The creature promised to show Anna how the forest spoke in roots and rot and weather. Anna's mother, after a night that left her sleepless, agreed to tell the full story of her grandmother's bargain, to name for others the fear she had inherited rather than the inevitability she had taught. The villagers argued and cried and negotiated under the spruce canopy, and in pockets of silence, Anna felt the new plan make a fragile scaffold. Yet, obstacles rose like stones in a river. Word would not stay secret. There were those in the village who could not accept the idea of bargaining away a tradition that had seemed to hold their lives. They feared exposure would invite outsiders who would take advantage of their vulnerability. The local forester, once a friend of the family, warned that the government would not look kindly on strange rites, and he hinted at bureaucracy and the hungry interest of journalists who viewed mystical villages as gold mines for spectacle. "You must be careful," he told Daniel in a low voice that trembled with an allegiance to order. "People leave, and they return with a hunger for profit. They are not all like you." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I don't want to profit off them," he said. "I want a fairer relationship." "But fairness has a cost," the forester replied. "You say you can offer papers and shelter, but what will you ask in return? The village is fragile. Honesty has repercussions when economies shift." And then there was Daniel's own secret. Small at first, then heavy. His father's deaths had something to do with the very reason Daniel had come here. His family owed money to a lending company that had disputed rural lands. The company had interest in mapping anomalies like the village's practices as aberrant and ripe for acquisition. Daniel had come with the intention of academic clarity, not corporate entanglement. But knowledge had strings. He told Anna one night in a whisper under the canopy of the observing creature, and she felt betrayed and frightened in equal measure. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. The sting of it made her speak in the blunt language she had learned to keep to herself. "I wanted to protect you," he said. "I thought if I could help rewrite the ledger quietly, there would be no reason for them to come." His hands cradled his own face as if to hold in a secret. It was a twist that turned intention into a hazard. Daniel's family's debt made his presence an unsteady anchor. The village's choice to speak its truths risked attracting attention that could turn into extraction. The creature's promise to help rework the bargain now had to accommodate the reality that outside forces had motives that could crush the fragile remaking. Anna's resolve hardened and softened at once, like glass in flame. She wanted to be free of being a ledger, but freedom required leadership, strategy, and sometimes sacrifice. The creature taught her to listen, to the roots that wound through the ground like veins, to the compost that remembered what had been fed into it. Daniel taught her to document, to ask questions that could protect the village without exposing its secrets to predators. Her mother taught her the names for herbs and the old melodies that could soothe fear. Dorina taught her how to speak tough truths to women whose lives had been carved by necessity. They began, painfully, to reweave their world. There were bumps. A journalist from a regional paper came nosing in, smelling a story, and was met with silence and the cold shoulders of a village that mistrusted headlines. A storm came, early and blustering, and the creature spent a night out in the open, turned into a human weathermaster the villagers didn't quite understand but could not deny. The community's divisions flared. Some thought Anna's voice was an answer to be followed. Others thought it was the first crack in a dam that would flood them with outsiders hungry for spectacle. All the while, Anna's body remembered that rope. Scars and the ache where it had cut into her wrists kept her company. At night, she would press her palms against the place where the knot had been and feel the phantom pressure of obligation. Daniel would sit beside her, sometimes with his hand hovering between wanting to touch and wanting to respect the new terms she was trying to write. The creature's presence was constant in a way that human bodies could not match, a slow vigilance, a weight of possibility and warning. Love, in the middle of this tumult, arrived in minute rebellions. A shared laugh over a failed attempt to brew a protective tea that smelled like ash. The way Daniel studied the contours of her face as if reading a map he dared not mark. The creature's small, incongruous gestures of care, like leaving a bed of moss arranged in the shape of a cradle outside Anna's hut. None of it made the ledger disappear. It simply braided additional options into the living fabric, choices she had never been taught she could make. As Act 2 closes, the village stands somewhere on the blade edge of decision. Rumors begin to uncoil outward like smoke. Some villagers are ready to brave the de-anchoring of tradition. Others are tightening their knots. Daniel's family debt looms near as a potential wrecking ball. The creature's patience holds but is not unlimited. And Anna, still raw from the rope and new from the creature's understanding and Daniel's soft urgings, has spoken a first tiny rebellion. She will not simply be the ledger entry written into the ring of the spruce. She will try to remap the bargain, to teach her people the language of consent, of mutual exchange, of roots that care rather than take. Outside the tree line, unseen, other forces begin to stir. A pair of city boots on a distant road, a letter stamped with official ink, a man with a camera who cannot resist a legend. Inside the spruce ring, the old lullabies are hummed differently now, threaded with doubt and determination. The creature's eyes watch Anna at night as she walks the edge of the forest, and in its gaze there is something like hope. The Pact's next move is uncertain. The ledger, for the first time in generations, might be open to revision. The cost of that revision could be ruin or renaissance. Anna holds the possibility like a small hot coal in her palm. Dangerous, luminous, and entirely hers to direct. The word betrayal was not loud when it arrived. It arrived like a rain that starts in the heart and then spreads slow and inexorable. It happened the morning after a sleepless night when Anna had counted the moths that clung to the lantern and tried to sort the shape of her anger into something useful. She was boiling nettle and chamomile by the window when the first knock sounded, a flat, official rap, and the tremor that ran through the village answered it like an animal scent. It was a sound that meant someone else had learned the existence of their bargains, and news like that never arrived alone. A man from the town office stood at the edge of the lane with papers folded in his hands and the expression of someone who had been schooled in uncomfortable truths. He claimed to have been tipped off by a responsible neighbor about unusual gatherings and endangered cultural practices. His letter smelled like bureaucracy and the city. His pen had been careful. He read the official phrasing, an inspection, an inquiry into public safety, and the village grew hard and small around him. Dorina's face went white as a sheet. "They will count us," she whispered, as if counting itself were a sin. The villagers clustered, some more frightened than others. The forester cursed under his breath and pressed for calm. The man was patient and implacable. He would come back with forms and questions and maybe men with badges. He did not yet know about the ledger or the creature, but the hint of taboo was enough to set him like a fox scenting a trap. When Daniel told Anna what he had overheard, his voice low because he could sense the swell of fear in her chest, she felt as if a bell had been struck inside her. The possibility of outsiders' hands riffling through their days made the village's fragile negotiations sound like tinder. "We cannot let them in," Dorina said. "If they find out the bargain exists, they'll write us into law books, put constraints on us, or worse, use our story to take what we have." Daniel's jaw tightened and his brow creased with the weight of a man whose intentions had always skirted an edge. "I told you there were threads I could not cut," he said. "My family, my father, he's involved with interests that want to remap rural land. I have tried to keep my work pure, but money finds maps, and maps find money." The revelation landed with a hard weight. For Anna, it was a betrayal not only of intention, but of intimacy. He had stood beside her and promised a different language. Instead, he had brought with him a history that could be used to translate her into an asset. The trust that had begun to grow between them, fragile as a sprout, felt sunblasted. "How many more secrets?" Anna asked, voice small but flinty. Her wrists were raw memory tight. She could still feel rope in the hollows of her skin. And the idea of being exchanged again, this time by paper and policy instead of braid and root, made her stomach drop. Daniel reached for her hand like a man trying to quiet a frightened animal. "I didn't tell you because I wanted to protect you," he said, the words too familiar now, like a script. "Protect me by omission?" she snapped. The village's faces looked at him as if seeing a stranger in the body of someone they'd started to trust. Dorina stepped forward, and the old anger she carried as protective instinct flared. "You speak of protection while your family signs checks that could put fences around our spruce." Daniel's confession fractured the tender new scaffolding they were building. A splintering of alliances went along the path like a bad rumor. The forester withdrew with a cautious face and muttered of laws. Some younger men muttered about selling timber if compensation came. Others swore that outsiders had always brought ruin. The knot of trust in the clearing untied itself in a heartbeat, and threads fell like rain. Then there was the deeper, more intimate fracture, the creature. It had been generous with patience, teaching Anna to listen to root size and to read the timing of sap flow like a language. It had shown in its slow, mossy gestures that it did not want to be a debtor-collector, but a steward of reciprocity. Yet when the first men with clipboards arrived, journalists smelling a story, bureaucrats smelling paperwork, the creature retreated to its more shadowed ways. It did not vanish. It folded itself back into the pulp of the forest, eyes like pit-stilled wells watching from distance. That withdrawal was perceived in the village as a warning or a withdrawal of favor, and fear traveled faster than the truth. Accusations began to have teeth. There were whispers that Anna's new friend from the city had opened a path that would end in their destruction. Others whispered that the creature had been seduced by the promise of new offerings, modern things the villagers could not imagine, yet might tempt its ancient patience. The ledger metaphor hardened and darkened. People who had been hesitant now found cause to pick a side. Anna found herself caught between loud, unanswerable histories. Her mother tried to stand beside her and failed. The old lullabies could not cover the new sounds. "I braided you because I feared the winter," her mother said, voice small and frayed. "I did what a mother must sometimes do." But the defense felt thin, both to Anna and to the onlookers. A mother's fear had birthed a chain. One woman's desperation had looped into a tradition. In the public eye of the village that used to be protective, it became complicity. One night, after a day of shouting and murmurs, a group of women cornered Anna near the well. They brandished old grievances. Their children had been spared because of bargains. The municipal inspector's letter could mean resources or ruin. They accused her of being naive and Daniel of being reckless. "You think you can change the world because you felt pity," Dorina said, spitting each syllable like an insect. "Pity will not feed mouths. It will not mend roofs. You'd hand us over to what we do not know." Anna listened. She felt like a rope bridge, swaying with every footstep of accusation. She wanted to scream that she had not wanted to be the ledger, that being the village's instrument had been worse than any jail. But when adrenaline cooled, she felt the hot, hurled need to hold them. To say yes, there had been bargains and fear, but fear should not determine the shape of another life. Instead, she found words stumbling, soft, inadequate. Daniel tried for diplomacy, for solutions. He offered to contact a legal aid office that helped rural communities fight corporate acquisition. He proposed safe frameworks for the village to reveal only what sanctified their practices, without exposing them to the hunger of profiteers. But every solution he offered bore his shadow, the knowledge that his family's debts could cancel out his goodwill, that his father's ledger might be the one to turn their names into lines on another balance sheet. The fracture widened into violence the evening the livestock refused to graze in a certain hollow of the forest, where the creature had once made its presence with small gifts of rain-sleek grass. Cows and goats balked, ears pinned, eyes wide. Dogs whined and pawed at the air. Old men said it was nothing. Young men said it was malice. Someone, in a fit of fear, brought a torch to the hollow. The fire licked at the roots, blackened the low brush, and the smell of soot reached the creature like wound wood. The creature came at dawn to the charred hollow, and its grief took shape like a storm. It did not strike the village, it did not lash out. Instead, it lifted its massive hand and, with surprising delicacy, laid down a bed of green, tree-sprung sprouts where the fire had burned. But those sprouts would take time. The villagers' panic would not be soothed by patience. Accusations now had targets. Fingers pointed at Daniel in angered meetings, at Anna as the one whose presence had invited change, at her mother for teaching a tradition that had become a chain, at Dorina for refusing to adapt. The once unified village convulsed into factions. Old friendships shrank into suspicion. Men who had split wood together for decades now kept their axes where they could be seen. People spoke of leaving, of selling parcels to urban developers who promised cash and a different kind of certainty. The ledger of bargains had become a ledger of greed, and everyone feared being recorded on the wrong side of the balance. In the middle of the crumbling solidarity, Anna retreated to the creature's edge and found it watching her in a way that felt like reading. "You have broken something," it said, voice like water on stone. There was no blame in it, only the gravity of something ancient being forced to reckon with human impatience. "I didn't mean to," she said. The apology felt worthless and vital at once. "I wanted to unbind us. I wanted to be more than a payment." "You wanted to be a voice," the creature replied. "But voices can hurt if they do not hold the whole chorus. You wanted to change the ledger without tending all its margins." Anna knew, in a sudden clarity that felt like a bitter tonic, that she had been too focused on being freed and not focused enough on the labor of change. Change would require tending the margins, convincing the afraid, confronting profiteers, weaving legal defenses, rewriting rituals with elders who feared erosion as loss. It would require hard, unromantic work, meetings, petitions, negotiations, and, perhaps worse, the acceptance that not everyone would consent. That night, Daniel stayed with her beneath a lean roof made of planks sanded by harvest winds. He placed his hand over hers, tentative now in ways both tender and apologetic. "I never wanted to bring harm," he said, "but I see now that I brought more than I could carry." "You came with love," she answered, but even that small mercy felt like something to be rationed. He leaned in and kissed her, soft, desperate, and for a second she allowed herself to be softened. Then she pulled back. The kiss made the fractures ache. Between them, trust had been scuffed. In the village, alliances had been cracked. For the creature, a long patience had been tested. "How do we fix this?" Daniel asked, raw as a file. Anna looked at his face and then at the forest's dark rim. "We do the slow work," she said. "We tell the truth to those who will listen. We find lawyers who do not hunt. We teach our elders that bargains can be reshaped without losing their meaning. We ask the creature to show us how to make offerings that are real exchanges, not thefts. We make the village a place where consent is taught, not assumed." "And if they won't listen?" Daniel's voice was small. "If the village chooses the old ledger?" "Then we will have to decide," she said. "The decision a stone placed carefully on a bridge. We will have to choose who we are willing to become. I would rather stand with a village that fights to change with me than one that binds another child because of fear." They did not have answers yet. They had more questions and a list of hard tasks: to meet with legal advisors in the city, to hold community councils where no old taboo would be spared, to set up watch systems against opportunistic outsiders, to teach the young the language of consent in lullabies that did not smother. The creature promised to teach Anna what the forest needed: how to read the health of soil and mycelium, how to craft offerings that restored rather than demanded. It would not be an easy pact to reweave. It would require more courage than anyone had expected. As the act closed, fractures lay like thin ice across the village river. Some would hold if tread carefully. Others would break under a careless foot. Love was no remedy on its own. It had to be smelted into cunning, law, community organizing, and the slow, grinding work of relearning how to speak across fear. The creature watched, the forester calculated. Dorina steeled herself, and Anna, raw, furious, luminous, felt the terrible, beautiful responsibility of wanting to rewrite an inheritance that had always been read as inevitable. The ledger was open now. The question was whether they had the hands to rebind it with justice rather than fear. The creature's breath fogged the morning as if it were exhaling a benediction and a warning at once. When the night watch alarm came, a child's scream cut short by a man's shout. Anna ran without thinking, Daniel at her shoulder. Torches lit like angry stars as a band of outsiders had crept to the village's edge. Men with clipboards, a camera's lens like a glass eye, and behind them a pair of municipal officers whose uniforms smelled of paper and finality. They had come under the pretense of inspection. The rumor had summoned opportunists. The villagers rallied in ragged formation, but fear made some hands tremble and others harden. "Get them away from the hollow," Dorina ordered, voice a whip of iron. She was not the same woman who had woven lullabies. Terror had knuckled her into something fierce. Anna's mother stood beside her, breath shallow, fingers digging into the worn leather of her palms. The creature had retreated to a stand of older pines, enormous shoulders hunched, watching the intruders through a curtain of needles. It did not roar. There was a deeper, older storm in its silence. Daniel pulled Anna back from the front line. "We can't make them run with anger," he hissed. "We need evidence of wrongdoing if they try to seize land. We have to hold them accountable." "They will take what they can," Dorina shot back. "Words are not fences." A shout rose. One of the outsiders, thick-shouldered, with a wallet like a statement, stepped too close to the hollow. He lifted a boot toward a sprig of the creature's new green. The creature moved then, not like a beast, but like a sentinel giving measure. It stepped into the clearing and raised one great hand, not in strike, but in offering. In its palm, a ring of light seemed to gather, condensed sap glowing faintly like embers. The men faltered. Something in them registered the wrongness of crushing new growth with a boot. One of the officers moved forward, paper flapping. "This is trespassing," he said. "We have complaints about unsafe rights." Anna felt the rope-raw memory of being bound flare in her chest. Not with fear now, something else. She walked into the space between the creature and the strangers. "You need to leave," she said, and her voice surprised her by being steadier than she felt. "This land belongs to us. We will not be catalogued and auctioned." The officer looked at her as if she were a child speaking beyond her rank. Then the creature lowered its palm and touched the earth. Roots under the soil shivered like waking things, and a low hum ran through the clearing. The camera clicked. The man with the wallet stepped back as if some physical law forbade him. The presence of the creature had shifted the atmosphere into something juridical and ancient both, a court where the forest itself testified. Daniel stepped up beside Anna. He could have taken her hand, but instead he turned to the officers and spoke in measured tones, offering legal names, title deeds, ancestral claims that he had hastily compiled in the nights of uneasy planning. "This is protected communal land," he said. "There are covenants. Anyone hassling the village without warrant will be prosecuted." The officer's expression wavered. Modern law had a gravity the men with wallets feared. They began to retreat, cursing threats of courtrooms and contracts, the camera's lens clouding with indignation. The villagers cheered like a small animal escaping a trap. In the pushing back, a man lunged at the camera and shattered its glass. A handful of youth chased the intruders to the lane, boots beating dirt. For the first time since the fracture, the village moved with a single pulse. After the danger ended, the creature approached Anna again. Its eyes held something like relief and an ache that seemed to trees. "You stood in the open," it said. The words were not loud, but they landed like stones. "You risked yourself for your people." "I risked everything," she answered, voice cracked with wetness and triumph. "I risked losing them or saving them. I don't know which is worse." "It is not losing that defines you," it said. "It is choosing the shape of the risk. You choose reciprocity. That is brave." Daniel reached for her then. This time she took his hand. His fingers were warm and trembling, and he drew close enough that she could feel the prickle of his grief and relief. "They came because I was careless," he confessed, voice breaking. "My family's debts sent men to sniff out anomalies. I will fix this. I'll turn myself in if I need to. Only don't hand this place to those who would sell it." Anna heard the truth in him. It required a sacrifice. He had to sever the ties that had unknowingly endangered the village. He would go to the city, confront his father, renounce or negotiate the debt publicly. It was a humiliation he offered willingly. Love had sharpened into responsibility. "No," Anna said softly, surprising them both. "You will not burn for me alone." She let go of his hand and touched the creature's thumb with 2 fingers. The moss under her were damp and fragrant. "Our bargain will change, but not because one of us disappears into guilt. We rewrite together. You teach me what the forest needs. I teach my people how to give without losing a child. Daniel will help legally. We will all make sacrifices." The creature's shoulders dipped, an enormous nod. Its sacrifice would be different. To allow the village to change the tempo of the pact, to loosen the old ledger's chokehold. It would expose itself to human law and curiosity in return for a less brutal exchange. Labor and guardianship instead of lives. It placed a single strand of silvery bark in Anna's palm. It was warm, alive. "Plant this where the hollow burned," it said. "Tend it. Let it be a living contract." Anna felt the enormity settle in her belly like a stone that could be rolled. She and Daniel and the creature would bind themselves in a new way, not with rope, but with work, with legal defense, with the slow hands-on tending of meadows and roots and rituals recast as mutual obligation. The village gathered, some doubtful, most exhausted, but their faces were no longer brittle with accusation. They had a choice and a labor. That evening, as dusk stitched the spruce into the dark, Daniel left for the city to confront his father and the lenders, an act that might cost him family ties and security. He kissed Anna with a solemn tenderness, pressing his forehead to hers. "Come find me if I fail," he whispered. "I will be here," she said. "I will be learning. I will be planting." The creature watched them, then turned its great frame toward the hollow. Anna planted the silvery bark as the creature hummed a sound like rain starting. The villagers worked beside her, some bending, some skeptical, some newly resolute. The act of planting was small and monumental all at once, a seed of covenant laid into scorched earth, a promise that exchange could be remade. As they tamped soil and smoothed moss, Anna felt the rawness in her wrists as a memory that could be softened. She thought of the lullabies, now threaded with new verses about consent and tending and honest work. Love did not solve everything. It demanded sacrifice. Daniel's confrontation, the creature's exposure, the village's labor. But under the spruce, as the first shoots of the new pact pressed against the soil like small, brave teeth, Anna understood what redemption required: risk, repair, and the courage to bind oneself not as payment but as partner. Morning found the village moving as if stitched together by new purpose and uncertain forgiveness among neighbors and cautious hope. Anna woke with soil under her nails and a lullaby new as sunlight coiled in her throat like a promise. The sapling grew silently where she planted the creature's silvery bark, its root like a tether to futures and reckonings. Daniel returned months later, gaunt from confrontation and softened by consequences he had made his own, and still full love. He brought papers, apologies, and a legal pledge that invited outsiders to respect boundaries or face consequences and communal oversight. The elders argued until dawn, and then argued again, softening like old leather under earnest care and practical compromise forming. Dorina, whose hands had measured generations, learned to temper fear with counsel and small brave experiments that invited wider conversation. The creature came to meetings in scent and sleep, teaching Anna how to read root language and reciprocity and compromise. Villagers learned to give labor and song instead of lives, composting offerings into beds that coaxed health and soil recovery. The forester brokered protections with municipal authorities and taught youth how maps could defend, not sell, if used with care. Some families chose cash and left, others stayed, learning that leaving was also a choice honored without contempt or shame. At night, Anna walked the ring and hummed new verses about consent, soil, and holding one's neighbor's hand and courage. Daniel taught children Latin names of plants, but also how to translate consent into everyday acts and songs and boundaries. The creature softened in public, leaving gifts of moss cradles and water clearings for village wells each full moon night. Anna and Daniel loved in the slow grammar of partnership, arguments, apologies, building fences that were metaphors, and tending together. Her mother taught younger mothers songs that named consent, and her hands no longer braided offerings into resigned futures only. Trust returned like slow sap. Sometimes it leaked and stained, sometimes it hardened into useful craft and law and ritual. The journalist who once prowled left with a story about resilience rather than spectacle, chastened by community dignity and respect. Daniel settled debts openly, losing privilege but gaining the village's wary blessing and Anna's steadier faith in him and partnership. Years later, Anna sat beneath the ring, fingers in soil, listening as children learned lullabies that taught consent and courage.